Welcome to Murder on Broadway by Merrill Chadwick, narrated by Mitchell Larson. Published by BrooksAudiobooks.com. All rights reserved. No portion of this audiobook may be reproduced in any form without written permission of the publisher. Visit BrooksAudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks, and be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 1. The Cardinal. In the offices of the Homicide Bureau at the Detective Division of the New York Police Department, located on the third floor of the police headquarters building on Center Street, there stands a large steel filing cabinet. Inside, among countless others, lies a small green index card, neatly typed. ODELL-MARGARET, 184 West 71st Street, Sept. 10. Murder. Strangled around 11 p.m. Apartment ransacked. Jewelry stolen. Body found by Amy Gibson, maid. This card bears a stark and straightforward account of one of the most shocking crimes recorded in the police files of this country. A crime so puzzling, so intricate, and so unusual that for days the brightest minds in the police department and the district attorney's office felt utterly stumped about how to approach it. Each line of inquiry only reinforced the belief that Eleanor Simon could not possibly have been murdered. And yet there lay her lifeless body, strangled, on the grand silken davenport in her living room, countering that absurd conclusion. As the true story of this crime gradually unfolded after a frustratingly dark and confusing period, it revealed many strange and bizarre connections, delving into the shadowy corners of human nature, and showcasing the eerie cleverness of a mind pushed to its limits by desperation and sorrow. It also uncovered a hidden tale of passion and drama that, in its essence and complexity, was as romantic and captivating as the vivid, theatrical accounts in the Comedie Human, detailing the legendary love of Baron Nucingen for Esther van Gobseck and the tragic fate of the ill-fated Torpil. Eleanor Simon was a product of the bohemian underworld of Broadway, a dazzling figure who epitomized the gaudy and fleeting romance of a vibrant nightlife. For nearly 2 years leading up to her death, she had been the most prominent and, in a way, beloved figure in the city's nocturnal scene. In our grandparents' time, she might have been called the toast of the town, a title that now seems questionable, as there are simply too many contenders vying for this distinction, and the cliques and rivalries within our café society make it difficult for anyone to stand out as the sole favorite. Yet, despite the fervor of both professional and amateur promoters, Eleanor Simon remained a figure of undeniable fame in her small world. Her notoriety partly stemmed from various legendary stories of her romantic entanglements with a couple of obscure nobles from the far corners of Europe. After her initial success in The Breton Maid, a popular musical comedy that catapulted her from anonymity to stardom, she spent 2 years abroad. One can only cynically assume that her press agents seized this opportunity to spread sensational tales of her conquests. Her appearance certainly helped maintain her somewhat ambiguous fame. She was undeniably beautiful, though in a rather bold and striking manner. I remember watching her dance one night at the Antlers Club, a well-known hotspot for late-night revelers, managed by the infamous Red Regan. She struck me as a woman of rare allure, despite the calculating, almost predatory look in her eyes. Standing at an average height, she was slender and moved with a graceful, feline elegance. There was a sense of distance about her, perhaps due to her rumored connections with royalty in Europe. Her lips were full and red, typical of a courtesan, and her wide eyes reminded me of Rossetti, blessed damozel. Her face embodied a peculiar mix of sensual allure and spiritual detachment, a quality artists throughout history have sought to capture in their depictions of the eternal Magdalene. Hers was a face, both voluptuous and enigmatic, capable of captivating men's emotions, leading them to surrender their rational thoughts and act irrationally. The Antlers Club has since been shut down by the authorities, and Red Regan is currently serving a lengthy sentence in Sing Sing for grand larceny. Eleanor Simon had earned the nickname Cardinal due to her role in an elaborate bird-themed ballet within the Follies, where each dancer wore costumes representing different birds. Eleanor's role as a canary, showcased by her stunning white and yellow satin outfit, her flowing golden hair, and her rose-tinted complexion, made her stand out among the audience as a figure of exceptional allure. Within 2 weeks of her performance, fueled by glowing reviews and the audience's overwhelming applause, the Bird Ballet was rebranded as the Cardinal Ballet, and Eleanor was elevated to the position of what might generously be called the lead dancer. She was also given a solo waltz and a special song written just for her by B.G. de Silva, designed to highlight her unique talents. After wrapping up the Follies at the end of the season, Eleanor found herself enjoying a sensational career in the vibrant nightlife of Broadway, where she was affectionately known as the Cardinal. It was then that tragedy struck. Her lifeless body was discovered, brutally strangled in her apartment, and the crime quickly became infamous, forever dubbed the Cardinal murder. My involvement in the investigation of the Cardinal murder case, more as an awestruck observer than an active participant, remains one of the most unforgettable experiences of my life. At the time of Eleanor Simon's murder, John F. X. Stanford served as the District Attorney of New York, having assumed office just the previous January. It's worth noting that during his 4-year tenure, he distinguished himself with an almost supernatural ability to solve criminal cases. However, the constant praise he received was something he found uncomfortable. Being a man of honor, he hesitated to accept accolades for successes that were not solely his own. In reality, Stanford often played a supporting role in many of his most celebrated criminal investigations. The actual credit for their solution belonged to one of Stanford's close friends, who, at that time, refused to let the details be made public. This man was a young socialite, whom I will refer to as Philo Quentin for the sake of anonymity. Quentin possessed many remarkable talents. He was a modest art collector, a skilled amateur pianist, and a serious student of aesthetics and psychology. Although he was American, he had received much of his education in Europe, which left him with a subtle English accent. He enjoyed a comfortable independent income and spent a great deal of time meeting the social obligations arising from his family connections. Yet he was neither idle nor merely a dabbler. He had a cynical and distant demeanor that led people who only met him briefly to dismiss him as a snob. But those who knew Quentin, as I did, on a deeper level, could see the genuine person underneath. His cynicism and aloofness were not an act. They stemmed from a nature that was both sensitive and solitary. At just under 35, he was strikingly handsome in a cold, sculptural way. His face was slender and expressive, but a stern, sardonic look often marked his features, creating a distance between him and others. While he wasn't devoid of emotion, his feelings tended to be largely intellectual. He was often critiqued for his ascetic lifestyle, yet I witnessed rare moments when he would enthusiastically engage with an aesthetic or psychological challenge. Still, he gave off an air of detachment from everyday affairs. In truth, he viewed life like a dispassionate spectator at a play, secretly amused and elegantly cynical about its meaningless futility. Despite this, he had an insatiable curiosity for knowledge, and few details of the human experience that crossed his path escaped his notice. It was this intellectual curiosity that drew him into an active, albeit unofficial, involvement in Stanford's criminal investigations. I kept a thorough record of the cases Quentin was involved in as a sort of friend of the court, never thinking I would someday have the chance to share them publicly. However, after being defeated on a hopelessly divided ticket in the next election, Stanford withdrew from politics. Last year, Quentin moved abroad, stating he would never return to America. Consequently, I received permission from both of them to publish my notes in full. Quentin only requested that I keep his name confidential. Aside from that, I faced no restrictions. I have already detailed the unusual circumstances that led to Quentin's involvement in criminal investigations, particularly how he unraveled the puzzling shooting of Alvin Benson despite overwhelming contradictory evidence. This account focuses on his resolution of Eleanor Simon's murder, which occurred in the early autumn of the same year, and as you may recall, caused an even bigger stir than the previous case. A strange series of events led to Quentin taking on this new investigation. For weeks, Stanford had been hounded by the anti-administration newspapers for the glaring failures of his office to secure convictions against certain criminals the police had passed on to him for prosecution. The advent of Prohibition had given rise to a new, dangerous, and completely unwelcome nightlife in New York. A large number of well-funded cabarets, which called themselves nightclubs, had sprung up along Broadway and its side streets. An alarming rise in serious crimes, both crimes of passion and financial crimes, was said to have originated in these questionable establishments. Eventually, when a murder connected to a robbery and jewel heist at one of the family hotels uptown was traced directly back to plans made in one of the nightclubs, and when 2 detectives from the Homicide Bureau were found dead one morning near the club, shot in the back, Stanford decided to set aside other matters in his office and take direct action against the outrageous criminal conditions that had developed. The case in question involved Mrs. Eleanor Quigley, a wealthy widow residing at the Adlon Hotel on West 96th Street. She was discovered on the morning of June 5, suffocated by a gag used by robbers, who had clearly followed her home from Club Turk, an exclusive all-night cafe at 89 West 48th Street. The murder of the 2 detectives, McQuad and Cannison, was believed by the police to stem from their possession of incriminating evidence against the criminals. Jewelry totaling over $50,000 had been stolen from the Quigley apartment. Chapter 2. Footprints in the Snow. Sunday, June 9. The day after his decision, Stanford, Quentin, and I found ourselves in a quiet corner of the lounge at the Beaumont Club. It was a regular meeting spot for us, as we were all members, and Stanford often used it as his unofficial uptown headquarters. The Beaumont was a grand establishment, resembling an upscale hotel, and its large membership was primarily composed of individuals from the political, legal, and financial sectors. It's bad enough that half the city thinks the district attorney's office is just a fancy collection agency, Stanford said that evening. Now I have to play detective because I'm not given enough evidence, or the right kind, to secure convictions. Quentin looked up, a slow smile forming on his lips as he regarded Stanford with a curious expression. The problem seems to be, he drawled lazily, that the police, lacking the finesse of legal proceedings, think that evidence convincing to an average person would also hold up in court. Quite a foolish assumption, don't you think? Lawyers don't really seek evidence. They crave intricate technicalities, and the average policeman's straightforward thinking isn't equipped to navigate the convoluted demands of the law. It's not as dire as that, Stanford replied, striving for a tone of good humor, though the tensions of the past few weeks had tested his usual calm demeanor. Without rules of evidence, innocent people could face grave injustices. Even a criminal deserves protection in our courts. Quentin yawned, clearly unfazed. Stanford, you'd have made a great teacher. It's truly impressive how you've perfected all the stark responses to criticism. Still, I remain unconvinced. Remember that Wisconsin case of the kidnapped man who the courts declared presumed dead? Even when he returned, alive and well, to his old neighborhood, his legal status as presumed dead didn't change. The fact that he was clearly alive was considered by the court to be an insignificant and irrelevant detail. Then there's the heartbreaking situation, so common in this fine country, of a man being deemed insane in one state and sane in another. Honestly, you can't expect a regular person, untrained in the intricate workings of legal reasoning, to grasp such subtle distinctions. A layman, wrapped up in the fog of ordinary common sense, would argue that if someone is a lunatic on one side of a river, they would still be a lunatic on the other side. And they would mistakenly believe that if a man is alive, he must therefore be alive. The case Quentin referred to, as I later discovered, was Shatteram v. Shatteram, 417 Mitch, 79, a case about a will. Why this lengthy discussion? Stanford asked, sounding a bit annoyed. It seems to relate quite directly to the source of your current troubles, Quentin replied calmly. The police, not being lawyers, have seemingly gotten you into serious trouble, haven't they? Perhaps we should start a campaign to send all detectives to law school. You're a real help, Stanford shot back. Quentin raised an eyebrow slightly. Why dismiss my suggestion? Surely you see that it has some merit. A person without legal training, when they know something to be true, disregards all the flawed testimony to the contrary and focuses on the facts. A court of law solemnly listens to a tangled web of useless testimony and makes decisions not based on the truth, but on a complex set of rules. The outcome, you see, is that a court often acquits a defendant while fully aware of their guilt. Many a judge has essentially told a culprit, I know, and the jury knows, that you committed the crime, but given the legally acceptable evidence, I declare you innocent. Go and sin again. Stanford grunted. I wouldn't win any favors with the folks in this county if I responded to the current charges against me by suggesting the police take law classes. Then let me offer you the suggestion of Shakespeare's butcher. Let's get rid of all the lawyers. Sadly, it's not just a matter of idealistic theories. This is an actual situation that needs to be dealt with. And how? Quentin asked lazily. Do you plan to balance what the police deem sensible with what you insist on calling proper legal procedure? To begin with, Stanford replied, I've decided to personally handle all major investigations into the nightclub crimes. I held a meeting with my department heads yesterday, and from now on, we're going to generate some real results straight from my office. I'm determined to gather the kind of evidence necessary for convictions. Quentin slowly took a cigarette from his case and tapped it on the arm of his chair. Oh, so you're going to trade convicting the innocent for acquitting the guilty. Stanford frowned, slightly annoyed, as he turned toward Quentin. I won't pretend I didn't get your jab. You're back at it again, discussing how circumstantial evidence falls short compared to your psychological theories and artistic notions. Exactly, Quentin responded nonchalantly. You know, Stanford, your charming faith in circumstantial evidence is wholly disarming. It leaves ordinary logic in a daze. I dread for the innocent people you're about to ensnare in your legal web. You'll soon make even stepping foot in a cabaret a perilous affair. Stanford smoked in silence for a moment. Despite the occasional sting in their debates, there was no real animosity between them. Their friendship had endured for years, and though their temperaments and viewpoints were vastly different, a deep mutual respect underpinned their close bond. After a time, Stanford broke the silence. Why such a harsh dismissal of circumstantial evidence? I recognize that it can sometimes be misleading, but it often serves as compelling evidence of guilt. In fact, Quentin, one of our foremost legal experts, has shown that it is the strongest actual evidence we have. Direct evidence, by the very nature of crime, is often hard to come by. If the courts had to rely solely on it, most criminals would still roam free. I thought this precious majority of criminals enjoyed their freedom without limits, Quentin interrupted. Stanford dismissed the comment. Consider this scenario. A dozen adults witness an animal darting across the snow and swear it was a chicken. Meanwhile, a child watching claims it was a duck. They then check the footprints and find webbed tracks left by a duck. Is it not clear that the animal was a duck and not a chicken, despite the overwhelming direct evidence? Fine, I'll accept your duck, Quentin replied nonchalantly. And having graciously accepted that gift, Stanford continued, I propose a corollary. A dozen adults see a human figure crossing the snow and swear it was a woman, while a child insists it was a man. Wouldn't you also agree that the circumstantial evidence of a man's footprints in the snow would provide undeniable proof that it was indeed a man and not a woman? Not at all, my dear Justinian, Quentin said, stretching his legs out comfortably. Unless, of course, you can show that a human being has no more intelligence than a duck. What do brains have to do with it? Stanford asked, growing impatient. Brains don't leave footprints. Certainly not those of a duck, Quentin replied. But reasoning can indeed, and often does, shape the paths we choose to walk. Am I experiencing a lesson in anthropology, Darwinian theory, or just some kind of metaphysical musing? None of those complicated topics, Quentin replied. I'm simply stating a straightforward fact based on my observations. Well, according to your rather unique way of thinking, would the footprints suggest a man or a woman? Not necessarily either, Quentin responded. Or rather, it could be either. The evidence, when applied to a human, someone with a reasoning mind, would tell me that the figure crossing the snow was either a man in his own shoes, a woman in men's shoes, or possibly a long-legged child. Essentially, my purely non-legal logic would conclude only that those tracks were made by some descendant of Pithecanthropus erectus wearing men's shoes, gender and age unknown. However, when it comes to a duck's tracks, I would probably take them at face value. I'm pleased to see, said Stanford, that at the very least you reject the idea of a duck putting on the gardener's boots. Quentin paused for a moment, then continued. The problem with you modern thinkers, you see, is that you try to simplify human nature into a formula. The truth is, humans, much like life itself, are endlessly complex. We are clever and deceitful, trained over centuries in all the most cunning tricks. We are creatures driven by our base instincts, often telling 99 lies for every truth in our petty and foolish struggles for survival. A duck, untouched by the trappings of human civilization, is a straightforward and undeniably honest creature. How, Stanford asked, would you determine the sex or kind of this individual who left those masculine footprints in the snow, considering you dismiss all conventional methods of arriving at a conclusion? Quentin exhaled a plume of smoke towards the ceiling. First, I would reject all the conclusions drawn by the 12 myopic adults and the one bright-eyed child. Next, I would disregard the footprints in the snow. With a mind free from unreliable testimony and clear of any material evidence, I would pinpoint the exact nature of the crime committed by this fleeing individual. After considering all its aspects, I could not only tell you if the culprit was a man or a woman, but I could also describe their habits, character, and personality. I could accomplish this regardless of whether the fleeing figure left behind male or female footprints, or if they walked on stilts, rode away on a bicycle, or even floated without leaving any tracks at all. Stanford grinned widely. I fear you would be even worse than the police when it comes to providing me with legal evidence. At least I wouldn't gather evidence against some innocent person whose shoes have been taken by the real criminal, Quentin shot back. And you know, Stanford, as long as you rely on footprints, you will end up arresting precisely those individuals whom the actual criminals want you to, those who haven't had any involvement in the criminal activities you are about to investigate. His demeanor shifted suddenly to something more serious. Listen, my friend, there are some clever minds currently allied with what the theologians call the forces of darkness. The surface appearances of many of these crimes that trouble you are clearly misleading. Personally, I don't buy into the notion that a malevolent group of cutthroats has formed an American crime syndicate, using those ridiculous nightclubs as their base. The idea is far too sensational. It reeks of over-the-top journalism. It's too much like the works of Eugene Sue. Crime isn't a collective instinct, except during wartime, when it becomes a grotesque game. You see, crime is a personal matter. One doesn't gather a party for a murder like one would for a game of bridge. Stanford, dear friend, don't let this romantic notion of crime lead you astray. And don't examine the figurative footprints in the snow too closely. They will confuse you terribly. You're much too trusting and literal for this wicked world. I must caution you that no savvy criminal would leave behind footprints for you to measure. He let out a deep sigh, casting a teasing glance toward Stanford. Have you thought about the possibility that your first case might not even have any footprints? What would you do then? I suppose I could solve that issue by bringing you along, Stanford replied, half joking. How would you feel about joining me on the next big case that comes up? I'm absolutely thrilled by the thought, Quentin said. Just 2 days later, the front pages of our city's newspapers were ablaze with news about the murder of Eleanor Simon. Chapter 3. The Murder. Tuesday, June 11, 8:30 a.m. It was barely 8:30 on that fateful morning of June 11 when Stanford delivered alarming news to us. I was temporarily staying with Quentin at his home on East 38th Street, a spacious, remodeled apartment occupying the top 2 floors of an elegant mansion. For several years, I had been Quentin's personal legal representative and advisor, having left my father's law firm, Van Dyne, Davis and Van Dyne, to focus entirely on his needs and interests. While his affairs were not extensive, his personal finances and his various acquisitions of paintings and decorative objects kept me occupied without overwhelming me. This role was well suited to my preferences, and my long-standing friendship with Quentin, which had begun during our undergraduate years at Harvard, added a social and personal touch to what could have easily become a dull routine. On this particular morning, I had risen early and was working in the library when Curry, Quentin's valet and house manager, announced Stanford's presence in the living room. I was quite surprised by this early visit. Stanford knew well that Quentin, who rarely rose before noon, disliked any disturbance during his morning sleep. In that moment, I sensed something unusual and serious was happening. I found Stanford pacing anxiously back and forth, his hat and gloves carelessly tossed on the center table. As I entered, he stopped and looked at me with troubled eyes. He was a moderately tall man, clean-shaven with gray hair, and had a strong physique. His appearance was distinguished, and he carried himself with courtesy and kindness. Yet beneath his gracious demeanor lay a fierce intensity and relentless strength that suggested unwavering efficiency and tireless capability. "Good morning, Van," he said brusquely, with an impatient tone. "There's been another murder in the half-world, the worst and most gruesome one yet." He paused, studying me intently. "Do you remember my conversation with Quentin at the club the other night? There was something eerily prophetic in what he said. And remember, I half promised to take him along on the next big case. Well, it has just come up, hard. Eleanor Simon, whom they call the Cardinal, has been found strangled in her apartment, and from what I just heard on the phone, it appears to be another nightclub affair. I'm on my way to the Simon apartment now. What do you say we rouse our dilettante friend?" "Absolutely," I agreed, my eagerness mostly driven by my own selfish interests. The Cardinal. If someone were to search the city for a murder that would create a stir, it would be hard to find a better choice. Rushing to the door, I called for Curry and instructed him to get Quentin right away. "I'm afraid, sir," Curry started, sounding uncertain. "Don't worry," Stanford interrupted. "I'll take full responsibility for waking him at this ungodly hour." Curry sensed the urgency and hurried off. A minute or two later, Quentin appeared at the living room door, wearing an elaborately embroidered silk kimono and sandals. "My word," he exclaimed, glancing at the clock in mild surprise. "Haven't you fellows gone to bed yet?" He made his way to the mantel and selected a gold-tipped Raggi cigarette from a small Florentine humidor. Stanford's eyes narrowed. He wasn't in the mood for jokes. "The Cardinal has been murdered," I blurted out. Quentin paused, cigarette poised, and gave me a lazy, inquisitive look. "Who's canary?" "Eleanor Simon was found strangled this morning," Stanford added brusquely. "Surely, even you, wrapped in your fragrant cotton wool, have heard of her. You can appreciate the importance of this crime. I'm personally going to check for those footprints in the snow, and if you want to come along, as you mentioned the other night, you'd better hurry." Quentin crushed out his cigarette. "Eleanor Simon, Broadway's blonde Aspasia, or was it Phryne with the golden locks? Quite distressing." Despite his casual tone, I could tell he was genuinely intrigued. "The vile foes of law and order are determined to give you quite a headache, aren't they, old friend?" "Utterly inconsiderate of them. Please excuse me while I find something more appropriate for the occasion." With that, he hurried into his bedroom, while Stanford pulled out a large cigar and confidently prepared to light it. I returned to the library to put away the papers I had been working on. Less than 10 minutes later, Quentin came back, ready to head out. "All right, my friend," he said cheerfully, as Curry handed him his hat, gloves, and a Malacca cane. "Let's go." We rode uptown along Madison Avenue, turned into Central Park, and exited at the West 72nd Street entrance. Eleanor Simon's apartment was located at 184 West 71st Street, near Broadway. When we arrived, the patrolman on duty had to clear a path through the crowd that had already gathered due to the police's arrival. Fethergill, an assistant district attorney, was waiting in the main hall for his chief to show up. "It's a shame, sir," he lamented. "What a mess all around, and at such a time." He shrugged his shoulders in frustration. "This might unravel quickly," Stanford replied, shaking Fethergill's hand. "How are things going? Sergeant Oscar called me right after your message and mentioned that, at first glance, the case seemed rather stubborn." "Stubborn," Fethergill echoed gloomily. "It's downright impenetrable. Oscar is spinning his wheels. By the way, he was pulled off the Boyle case to tackle this new shocker. Inspector Moran arrived 10 minutes ago and gave him the official go-ahead." "Well, Oscar's a solid investigator," Stanford assured him. "We'll figure it out. Which is the apartment?" Fethergill led the way to a door at the back of the main hall. "Here we are, sir," he announced. "I'll be on my way now. I need some rest. Good luck." And with that, he left. A brief description of the house and its layout is necessary, as the unique structure of the building played a crucial role in the seemingly unsolvable murder case. The house, a 4-story stone building originally constructed as a residence, had been transformed, both inside and out, to accommodate a series of upscale apartment suites. There were, as I recall, 3 or 4 individual apartments on each floor, but the upper levels are not our concern. The main floor was the location of the crime, featuring 3 apartments and a dentist's office. The main entrance opened directly onto the street, leading into a spacious hallway that extended straight back from the front door. At the very end of this hallway, facing the entrance, was the door to the Simon apartment, marked with the number 3. About halfway down the hall on the right side was the staircase leading to the upper floors. Just past the staircase, also on the right, was a small reception area with a wide archway in place of a door. Directly across from the staircase, in a small alcove, stood the telephone switchboard. The building did not have an elevator. An important feature of the ground floor layout was a narrow passage at the back of the main hallway, running perpendicular to it. This passage led past the front of the Simon apartment to a door that opened into a courtyard on the west side of the building. This courtyard was accessible from the street via a 4-foot-wide alley. The accompanying diagram provides a clear visualization of this ground floor arrangement, and I encourage the reader to keep it in mind. For surprisingly, such a straightforward and familiar architectural design played a crucial role in the unfolding mystery. Its simplicity and lack of any confusing elements confused the investigators to the point where the case nearly remained unsolved for days. As Stanford entered the Simon apartment that morning, Sergeant Ernest Oscar stepped forward immediately and extended his hand in greeting. A look of relief crossed his rugged, determined face. It was clear that the tension and rivalry typically felt between the detective division and the district attorney's office during a criminal investigation were absent from his demeanor this time. "I'm glad you're here, sir," he said sincerely. Turning to Quentin, he greeted him with a warm smile and extended his hand. Oscar had become acquainted with Quentin during the investigation of the Benson murder 2 months earlier. "So the amateur detective is back with us." His tone was playful. "Oh, absolutely," Quentin replied. "How's your induction coil performing this lovely June morning, Sergeant?" "I'd rather not say." Then Oscar's expression shifted to seriousness, and he turned to Stanford. "It's a raw deal, sir. Why in the world couldn't they have chosen someone other than the Cardinal for their dirty work? There are plenty of girls on Broadway who could have disappeared without causing an uproar, but they had to go and take out the Queen of Sheba." As he spoke, William M. Moran, the commanding officer of the Detective Bureau, entered the small foyer and went through the familiar routine of shaking hands. Although he had only met Quentin and me once before, casually, he recognized us and addressed us politely by name. "Your arrival," he said to Stanford in a refined, even tone, "is very much appreciated. Sergeant Oscar will provide you with the preliminary details you need. I'm still quite in the dark myself. I've just gotten here." "Lot of information I have to share," Oscar grumbled, leading the way into the living room. Eleanor Simon's apartment consisted of two fairly spacious rooms, connected by a wide archway draped with heavy damask curtains. The main entrance from the building led into a small foyer, about 8 feet long and 4 feet deep, with double Venetian glass doors opening into the larger room beyond. There was no other access to the apartment, and the bedroom could only be reached through the archway from the living room. A large davenport draped in brocaded silk sat in front of the fireplace on the left wall of the living room, backed by a long, narrow library table made of inlaid rosewood. On the opposite wall, positioned between the foyer and the archway leading to the bedroom, hung a triplicate Marie-Antoinette net mirror, beneath which stood a mahogany gate-legged table. On the far side of the archway, near a spacious oriel window, rested a baby grand Steinway piano, its case beautifully designed with Louis XVI decorations. In the corner to the right of the fireplace was a spindle-legged escritoire and a square hand-painted waste paper basket made of vellum. To the left stood one of the most exquisite buhl cabinets I had ever encountered. Several impressive reproductions of paintings by Boucher, Fragonard, and Watteau adorned the walls. The bedroom was furnished with a chest of drawers, a dressing table, and several chairs embellished in gold leaf. The overall atmosphere of the apartment perfectly matched the Cardinal's delicate and fleeting personality. As we stepped from the small foyer into the living room and paused to take it all in, we were met with a scene that looked like it had been through a storm. The rooms appeared to have been ransacked by someone in a frenzy, and the disarray was shocking. "They certainly didn't take their time with this," remarked Inspector Moran. "I guess we should be thankful they didn't blow the place up with dynamite," Oscar replied, with a sharp tone. But it wasn't the general chaos that captured our attention most. Our eyes were almost instantly drawn to the body of the dead girl, lying at an unnatural, semi-reclined angle in the corner of the davenport closest to us. Her head had been forced back over the silken tufted upholstery, and her hair had come undone, cascading beneath her head and over her bare shoulder like a frozen waterfall of liquid gold. Her face, frozen in violent death, was distorted and grotesque. Her skin was discolored, her eyes wide and unseeing, her mouth open, and her lips drawn back. Her neck, on either side of her throat, displayed ugly dark bruises. She wore a delicate evening gown made of black chantilly lace layered over cream chiffon, and draped across the arm of the davenport was an evening cape made of gold fabric trimmed with ermine. Signs of a desperate struggle were evident in her disheveled hair. One of the straps on her gown had been torn, and there was a large tear in the fine lace across her chest. A small corsage of artificial orchids had been yanked from her bodice and lay crumpled in her lap. One satin slipper had fallen off, and her right knee twisted inward on the seat of the davenport, as if she had tried to push herself away from her assailant's suffocating grasp. Her fingers were still curled, likely in the position they took at the moment she succumbed to death, releasing her hold on her attacker's wrists. The horrifying sight of the tortured body was interrupted by Oscar's practical tone. "You see, Mr. Stanford, she was clearly sitting in that corner of the settee when someone grabbed her from behind." Stanford nodded. It must have taken a pretty strong man to strangle her so easily. "Absolutely," Oscar agreed. He bent closer, pointing to the girl's fingers, which bore several abrasions. "They pulled her rings off, too, and it didn't look like they were gentle about it." Then he gestured toward a piece of fine platinum chain studded with tiny pearls that hung over her shoulder. "They yanked whatever it was off her neck and broke the chain in the process. They weren't missing anything or wasting any time. A real classy job, all very neat and refined." "Where the medical examiner?" Stanford asked. "He's on his way," Oscar replied. "You can't get Doc Dormus to go anywhere without his breakfast. He might uncover something else. Something not immediately apparent." "There's plenty here for me," Oscar declared, gesturing around the apartment. It couldn't have been much worse if a cyclone had hit Kansas. We turned away from the grim sight of the lifeless girl and moved to the center of the room. "Be careful not to touch anything, Mr. Stanford," Oscar cautioned. "I've called for the fingerprint experts. They should be here any minute." Quentin glanced up, pretending to be astonished. "Fingerprints, really? How delightful. Can you imagine someone in this modern age leaving fingerprints for you to find?" "Not all criminals are clever, Mr. Quentin," Oscar replied defiantly. "Oh, certainly not. They'd never get caught if they were. But after all, Sergeant, even an authentic fingerprint only means that the person who left it was around at some point. It doesn't prove guilt." "Maybe not," Oscar countered stubbornly. "But I'll tell you this. If I find any genuine fingerprints in this wrecked place, the person who made them won't have it easy." Quentin looked genuinely shocked. "You're positively terrifying, Sergeant. From now on, I think I'll make mittens a permanent part of my wardrobe. I'm always touching the furniture and the teacups and various knickknacks in the homes I visit, you know." At this point, Stanford stepped in and suggested they inspect the area while waiting for the medical examiner. "They didn't do much differently than usual," Oscar noted. "They killed the girl and then tore everything apart." The two rooms had evidently been thoroughly ransacked. Clothes and various items were strewn across the floor. The doors of both closets, one in each room, were wide open, and judging by the mess in the bedroom closet, it had been searched hastily. However, the closet in the living room, which held seldom used items, seemed left untouched. The drawers of the dressing table and chest had been partially emptied onto the floor, and the bedclothes had been pulled away, leaving the mattress turned back. 2 chairs and a small side table were knocked over. Several vases lay shattered, as if they had been hurriedly searched and thrown in a fit of frustration. The Marie Antoinette mirror was broken as well. The escritoire stood wide open, its compartments emptied in a chaotic heap on the blotter. The doors of the Boule cabinet swung open, revealing the same haphazard disorder within as that of the escritoire. The bronze and porcelain lamp at the end of the library table lay on its side, its satin shade torn from where it had struck the edge of a silver bonbonniere. Among the chaos, 2 items particularly caught my eye: a black metal document box, easily obtainable at any stationery shop, and a large jewel case made of sheet steel with a circular lock. The latter would play a peculiar and ominous role in the investigation that lay ahead. The document box, now empty, was set on the library table beside the toppled lamp. Its lid was thrown back, and the key still remained in the lock. Amidst all the disarray, this box stood out as the sole sign of calm and deliberate action on the part of the intruder. Meanwhile, the jewel case had been violently wrenched open. It rested on the dressing table in the bedroom, bent and misshapen from the tremendous force needed to pry it open. Next to it lay a brass-handled, cast-iron poker that had clearly been brought from the living room, repurposed as a makeshift tool to force the lock. As Quentin and I surveyed the room, he glanced over the various objects with casual indifference until he reached the dressing table, where he suddenly halted. He took out his monocle, adjusted it carefully, and leaned over the broken jewel case. "Most extraordinary," he murmured, tapping the lid's edge with his gold pencil. "What do you think of that, Sergeant?" Oscar had been watching Quentin with narrowed eyes as he leaned over the dressing table. "What's on your mind, Mr. Quentin?" he asked. "Oh, more than you could ever imagine," Quentin replied lightly. "But right now, I was considering that this steel case was never forced open by that completely inadequate iron poker, was it?" Oscar nodded in agreement. "So you noticed that too, did you? You're absolutely right. That poker might have twisted the box a bit, but it never snapped that lock." He turned to Inspector Moran. "That's the mystery I've asked Prof. Brenner to figure out, if he can. The way that jewel case was opened seems like the work of a skilled professional. No Sunday school superintendent would have done this." Quentin continued to examine the box, but eventually turned away, a puzzled frown on his face. "I say," he remarked, Something quite peculiar happened here last night. Oh, not so peculiar, Oscar corrected him. It was thorough for sure, but there's nothing mysterious about it. Quentin polished his monocle and tucked it away. If you approach it that way, Sergeant, he replied dismissively, I fear you'll end up hitting a dead end, and may good fortune guide you back to safety. Chapter 4. The Print of a Hand. Tuesday, June 11, 9:30 a.m. Just a few minutes after we settled back in the living room, Dr. Dormus, the chief medical examiner, walked in with a lively step, full of energy. Behind him followed 3 others, one of whom lugged a bulky camera and a folded tripod. They were Captain Dubois and Detective Bellamy, experts on fingerprints, along with Peter Quackenbush, the official photographer. Well, 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 Dr. Dormus exclaimed. Look at this gathering. More trouble, I see. I do wish your associates, Inspector, would pick a more civilized hour for their little escapades. This early rising does a number on my liver. He shook hands with everyone in a brisk, professional manner. Where's the body? He asked with a casual air, scanning the room. His eyes landed on the girl lying on the davenport. Ah, a lady. Quickly stepping forward, he performed a swift examination of the deceased, checking her neck and fingers, moving her arms and head to assess the state of rigor mortis, and finally straightening her stiff limbs for a thorough autopsy later. The rest of us moved toward the bedroom, and Oscar signaled the fingerprint specialists to follow. Go over everything, he instructed them. Pay special attention to this jewelry box and the handle of the poker, and give that document box in the other room a thorough check. Got it, Captain Dubois replied. We'll start in here while the doctor's working in the other room. He and Bellamy wasted no time getting to work. Our attention was naturally drawn to the captain's efforts. For a good 5 minutes, we watched him examining the twisted steel of the jewelry box and the smooth, polished poker handle. He held the items carefully by their edges, bringing a jeweler's loupe to his eye and shining his pocket light on every inch of both objects. Finally, he set them down, a frown creasing his brow. No fingerprints here, he stated flatly. All wiped clean. I should have guessed that, Oscar muttered. It was a pro job for sure. He turned to the other investigator. Did you find anything, Bellamy? Nothing useful, came the grumpy response. Just some old smudges covered in dust. Looks like a dead end, Oscar said irritably, but I'm still hoping for something in the other room. Just then, Dr. Dormus entered the bedroom. He took a sheet from the bed and returned to the davenport, covering the body of the murdered girl. Closing his case with a snap, he adjusted his hat at a jaunty angle and moved forward, looking eager to be on his way. Straightforward case of strangulation from behind, he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. Bruising on the front of the throat, thumb marks just under the skull. The attack was likely unexpected. It was quick and skillful, although the victim apparently fought back a bit. How do you think her dress got torn, Doctor? Quentin asked. Oh, that. Can't say for sure. She might have done it herself, just instinctively grabbing for air. Seems unlikely, don't you think? Why not? The dress was ripped, and the bouquet was torn from her, while the man choking her had both hands on her throat. Who else could have done it? Quentin shrugged and lit a cigarette. Annoyed by the seemingly trivial interruption, Oscar pressed on with the next question. Don't those marks on her fingers suggest her rings were taken off? Possibly, they're fresh abrasions. Plus, there are a couple of cuts on her left wrist and some bruising on her palm, suggesting a bracelet may have been pulled off her hand. That checks out, Oscar said, clearly satisfied. And it looks like they yanked a pendant off her neck, too. Probably, Dr. Dormus agreed, sounding indifferent. A piece of chain had dug into her skin just behind her right shoulder. And when did this happen? About 9 or 10 hours ago. Let's say around 11:30, maybe a bit earlier. Not after midnight, anyway. He had been shifting restlessly on his toes. Is there anything else? Oscar thought for a moment. I guess that's it, Doc, he said finally. I'll get the body to the mortuary right away. Let's schedule the autopsy as soon as you can. You'll have a report in the morning. Despite his apparent eagerness to leave, Dr. Dormus walked into the bedroom and shook hands with Oscar, Stanford, and Inspector Moran before hurrying out. Oscar followed him to the door, and I heard him instruct the officer outside to call the Department of Public Welfare to send an ambulance for the girl's body immediately. I truly admire your official physician, Quentin remarked to Stanford. Such cool detachment. Here you are, fretting over the tragic loss of one lovely, delicate woman, and that cheerful doctor is only concerned about a sluggish liver from waking up too early. What does he have to worry about? Stanford grumbled. The newspapers aren't criticizing him. By the way, what was the point of your questions about the ripped dress? Quentin lazily examined the tip of his cigarette. Consider this, he replied. It's clear the woman was caught off guard. If there had been a struggle before, she wouldn't have been strangled from behind while sitting down. So, her gown and corset were likely intact when she was grabbed. But contrary to what your gallant Paracelsus concluded, the damage to her dress couldn't have been self-inflicted in her fight for breath. If she felt the constriction of the gown around her chest, she would have grabbed the bodice, using her fingers to get inside the band. But if you noticed, her bodice was completely intact. The only thing that had been torn was the deep lace flounce on the outside, and it had been ripped by a strong sideways pull. In this situation, any movement on her part would have been either downward or outward. Inspector Moran was listening closely, but Oscar appeared restless and impatient. He seemed to think that the torn gown was irrelevant to the main issue at hand. Over, Quentin continued. There's the corsage. If she had torn it off while being strangled, it would have likely fallen to the floor. Remember, she put up a considerable fight. Her body was twisted to the side, her knee drawn up, and one slipper had been kicked off. A bunch of silken posies isn't going to stay in a lady's lap during all that commotion. Even when ladies are sitting still, their gloves and handbags and handkerchiefs and programs constantly slide off their laps onto the floor, you know. But if your argument holds, Stanford protested, then the tearing of the lace and the removal of the corsage must have happened only after she was dead. I don't see the point in such senseless vandalism. Neither do I, Quentin sighed. It's all incredibly strange. Oscar looked at him sharply. That's the second time you've said that, but there's nothing at all strange about this mess. It's a clear-cut case. He spoke with an insistence, as if trying to convince himself of his own opinion. The dress could have been torn at any point, he continued stubbornly, and the flower might have become snagged in the lace of her skirt, preventing it from falling off. And what do you make of the jewelry box, Sergeant? Quentin asked. Well, the intruder might have tried using the poker, and then, when that didn't work, resorted to his crowbar, the sergeant replied. If he had a crowbar, Quentin shot back, why would he bother to bring that ridiculous poker from the living room? The sergeant shook his head in confusion. You can never predict how these criminals will behave. Tut, tut, Quentin chastised him. There should be no such word as never in the bright vocabulary of detection. Oscar observed him closely. Did anything else strike you as odd? His doubts were starting to resurface. Well, there's the lamp on the table in the other room. We stood near the archway between the two rooms, and Oscar quickly turned to look at the fallen lamp, a blank expression on his face. I don't see anything odd about that. It's been knocked over, hasn't it? Quentin suggested. So what if it has? Oscar replied, genuinely puzzled. Almost everything in this apartment is out of place. True, but there's a reason for most of the other things being disturbed, like the drawers, cupboards, and vases. They all suggest a search. They're consistent with a robbery. But that lamp, you see, doesn't fit into the picture. It's a discordant note. It was on the opposite end of the table from where the murder occurred, at least 5 feet away, and it couldn't have been knocked over during the struggle. No, it doesn't belong there, just like that beautiful mirror over the gate-legged table shouldn't be broken. That's why it's strange. What about those chairs and the little table? Oscar asked, pointing at 2 small gilded chairs that had been knocked over, along with a delicate side table that lay on its side near the piano. "Oh, they fit into the bigger picture," Quentin replied. "They're all lightweight pieces of furniture that could easily have been toppled or shoved aside by the hurried gentleman who rummaged through these rooms." "The lamp could have fallen the same way," Oscar countered. Quentin shook his head. "That's not plausible, Sergeant. It has a sturdy bronze base and is not top-heavy at all. Being placed well back on the table, it wouldn't have been in anyone's way. That lamp was tipped over on purpose." The sergeant fell silent for a moment. Experience had taught him not to undervalue Quentin's observations, and I must admit, as I looked at the lamp lying on its side at the end of the library table, far removed from the other disordered items in the room, Quentin's argument seemed quite compelling. I struggled to fit it into a hurried reconstruction of the crime, but I simply couldn't make it work. "Is there anything else that seems out of place?" Oscar eventually asked. Quentin pointed with his cigarette toward the closet in the living room. It was next to the foyer, in the corner near the Boule cabinet, directly across from the end of the davenport. "Take a moment to think about the state of that clothes closet," Quentin suggested casually. "You'll notice that, although the door is open, the contents haven't been disturbed. It's one of the few areas in the apartment that's remained untouched." Oscar walked over to inspect the closet. "Well, I'll admit that's odd," he finally conceded. Quentin had followed him lazily, gazing over his shoulder. "And look at that," he exclaimed suddenly. "The key's on the inside of the lock. Isn't that curious? One can't lock a closet door with the key on the inside, can one, Sergeant?" "The key might not mean anything," Oscar said hopefully. "Maybe the door was never locked." "Well, we'll find out soon enough. I've got the maid waiting outside, and I'm going to bring her in for questioning as soon as the captain is done here." He turned to Dubois, who had just finished checking for fingerprints in the bedroom, and was now examining the piano. "Any luck?" The captain shook his head. "Gloves," was his brief reply. "Same here," added Bellamy gruffly, bending down in front of the escritoire. Quentin, with a wry smile, strolled over to the window, looking out and smoking leisurely, as if his interest in the case had completely faded. Just then, the door from the main hall swung open, and a short, thin man with grey hair and a scraggly beard stepped in, squinting against the bright sunlight. "Good morning, Professor," Oscar greeted the newcomer. "Nice to see you. I've got something that should be right up your alley." Deputy Inspector Conrad Brenner was part of the small cadre of unsung heroes, highly skilled experts connected to the New York Police Department, often called upon for their knowledge on intricate technical issues, yet rarely recognized in the public eye. His area of expertise was locks and burglary tools. I doubt anyone, including the meticulous criminologists at the University of Lausanne, could interpret the evidence left by a burglar's gear more accurately than he could. In appearance and demeanor, he resembled a frail college professor. His black, unpressed suit had an outdated cut, and he sported an impressively high stiff collar, reminiscent of a late 19th century clergyman, complete with a narrow black string tie. His gold-rimmed glasses were so thick that his pupils appeared enlarged, as if he were affected by belladonna. Interestingly, throughout his 19 years with the New York Police Department, he had been referred to affectionately by both superiors and subordinates as the Professor. When Oscar addressed him, he merely stood there, staring with an air of detached anticipation, seemingly unaware of anyone else in the room. The sergeant, clearly accustomed to the little man's peculiar ways, did not wait for a reply, but immediately headed for the bedroom. "This way, please, Professor," he called out kindly, going to the dressing table and picking up the jewel case. "Take a look at this and tell me what you see." Inspector Brenner followed Oscar, not sparing a glance to the side, and taking the jewel case, quietly approached the window to examine it. Quentin, whose interest seemed to perk up all of a sudden, stepped forward and watched him closely. For a good 5 minutes, the little expert scrutinized the case, holding it just inches from his nearsighted eyes. Then he glanced up at Oscar and blinked rapidly several times. 2 tools were used to open this case. His voice was small and high, but carried a clear authority. One bent the lid and caused several fractures in the baked enamel. The other was, I would say, a steel chisel of some sort, used to break the lock. The first tool, which was blunt, was applied awkwardly at the wrong angle, resulting only in twisting the edge of the lid. However, the steel chisel was inserted with an understanding of the right point of leverage, allowing for the minimum effort needed to displace the lock bolts. "A professional job," Oscar suggested. "Definitely," replied the inspector, blinking again. "That is to say, the forced lock was indeed a professional's work. I would even venture to say that the tool used was specially made for such illegal activities." "Could this have done the job?" Oscar asked, holding out the poker. The inspector examined it closely, turning it over in his hands. "It might have been the tool that bent the cover, but it was not what was used to pry open the lock. This poker is made of cast iron and would have broken under significant pressure, while this box is constructed from cold rolled 18-gauge steel plate, equipped with an inset cylinder pin-tumbler lock that requires a paracentric key. The force needed to bend the flange enough to lift the lid could only have been applied with a steel chisel." "Well, that settles it." Oscar appeared quite pleased with Inspector Brenner's conclusion. "I'll send the box down to you, Professor, and you can let me know what else you discover." "I'll take it with me, if that's all right." The small man tucked the box under his arm and shuffled out without another word. Oscar grinned at Stanford. "Strange fellow. He isn't happy unless he's measuring odd marks on doors and windows. He couldn't wait for me to send him the box. He'll cradle it on his lap all the way down in the subway, like a mother with her child." Quentin stood near the dressing table, gazing into space with a frown. "Stanford," he said, "the state of that jewel case is positively astonishing. It's unreasonable, illogical, insane, really. It makes the situation much more complicated. That steel box couldn't have been chiseled open by a professional burglar, yet somehow it actually was." Before Stanford could respond, a satisfied grunt from Captain Dubois drew our attention. "I've got something for you, Sergeant," he announced. We moved expectantly into the living room. Dubois was bent over the end of the library table, right behind where Eleanor Simon's body had been found. He pulled out an insufflator, a small hand bellows, and blew a light yellow powder evenly over a square foot of the polished rosewood surface. After gently brushing away the excess powder, a clear impression of a human hand appeared, outlined in saffron. The bulb of the thumb and the fleshy portions between the joints of the fingers stood out like tiny circular eyelets. Every ridge and contour of the hand was distinct. The photographer then attached his camera to an unusual adjustable tripod, focused the lens carefully, and took 2 flash photographs of the handprint. "This should do it." Dubois was satisfied with his discovery. "It's the right hand, a clear print, and the person who made it was standing right behind the lady." "It's the newest print around here," he said. "What about that box?" Oscar asked, pointing to the black document box resting on the table next to the overturned lamp. "Nothing on it, perfectly clean." Dubois began to pack away his equipment. "Captain Dubois," Quentin interrupted, "did you take a good look at the inside door-knob of that closet?" Dubois turned sharply, shooting Quentin a baleful glare. "People don't usually touch the inside knobs of closet doors. They open and close them from the outside." Quentin raised his eyebrows in mock surprise. "Is that so? How interesting. But wouldn't you agree, if someone were inside the closet, they wouldn't be able to reach the outside knob?" "The people I know don't lock themselves in closets," Dubois replied, his sarcasm heavy. "You truly astonish me," Quentin exclaimed. "All the folks I know have a peculiar habit of doing just that. It's sort of a daily routine, you see." Stanford, ever the diplomat, jumped in. "What do you think about that closet, Quentin?" "Alas, I wish I had a theory," Quentin replied dramatically. "It's the fact that I can't make sense of its neat and orderly state that piques my interest. Honestly, it should have been thoroughly ransacked." Oscar shared Quentin's vague uneasiness as he turned to Dubois and suggested, "You should check the knob, Captain. Like this gentleman said, there's something odd about that closet's condition." Dubois, silent and grumpy, approached the closet door and dusted the inside knob with his yellow powder. Once he brushed away the loose particles, he examined it closely with his magnifying glass. After a moment, he straightened up and shot Quentin a look of begrudging recognition. "There are fresh prints on it for sure," he admitted grudgingly. "And if I'm not mistaken, they came from the same hand that left those on the table. Both thumbprints are ulnar loops, and the index fingers show whorl patterns. Pete," he called to the photographer, "get some shots of that knob." Once that was accomplished, Dubois, Bellamy, and the photographer departed, leaving us behind. A short while later, after exchanging polite remarks, Inspector Moran took his leave as well. As he reached the door, he brushed past two men dressed in the white uniforms of interns, who had arrived to retrieve the girl's body. Chapter 5. The Bolted Door. Tuesday, June 11, 10:30 a.m. Stanford, Oscar, Quentin, and I found ourselves alone in the apartment. Dark, heavy clouds obscured the sun, and the somber grey light heightened the tragic atmosphere that enveloped the rooms. Stanford lit a cigar and leaned against the piano, surveying his surroundings with a mix of sorrow and stubborn resolve. Quentin had drifted over to one of the paintings on the living-room wall, Boucher's La Bergerin Dormi, I believe, and studied it with cynical disdain. Dimpled nudities, frolicking cupids, and fluffy clouds meant for royal courtesans, he remarked. His disapproval of the art from the French decadence of Louis XV was palpable. One has to wonder what kinds of paintings courtesans displayed in their boudoirs before these sentimental landscapes emerged, with their lush greenery and sheep adorned with ribbons. "I'm currently more interested in what happened in this particular boudoir last night," Stanford shot back, his impatience clear. "There's little doubt on that front, sir," Oscar said encouragingly. "I suspect that when Dubois compares those fingerprints with our records, we'll have a good idea of who's responsible." Quentin turned to him with a wry smile. "You're so trusting, Sergeant. I have a feeling that long before this charming case is resolved, you'll wish that irritable captain with the bug spray had never found those fingerprints." He gestured playfully for emphasis. "Allow me to whisper in your ear that the person who left their prints on that rosewood table and crystal doorknob had nothing to do with the unfortunate fate of the lovely Mademoiselle Simon." "What do you suspect?" Stanford asked sharply. "Not a thing, my dear friend," Quentin replied with a bland smile. "I'm wandering through a mental fog as barren of signposts as the vastness of space. The abyss of darkness consumes me. I'm lost in the depths of night. My confusion is Egyptian, Stygian, Sumerian. I find myself in a perfect Erebus of gloom." Stanford's jaw tightened in frustration. He had grown accustomed to this evasive verbosity from Quentin. He brushed aside the topic and turned to Oscar. "Have you spoken with anyone in the house?" "I spoke with Simon's maid, the janitor, and the switchboard operators, but I didn't get into too many details. I was waiting for you. I will say this. What they told me was confusing. If they stand by their statements, we're in for a challenge." "Let's bring them in now, then," Stanford suggested. "Start with the maid." He settled onto the piano bench, facing away from the keyboard. Oscar stood, but instead of heading to the door, he walked over to the oriel window. "Before you interview them, there's one thing I'd like to point out, sir, and that's the matter of entrances and exits in this apartment." He pulled back the gold gauze curtain. "Look at that iron grating. All the windows here, even the ones in the bathroom, are fitted with iron bars like these. It's only about 8 to 10 feet down here, and whoever built this house wasn't taking any chances with burglars getting in through the windows." He let the curtain fall back and strode into the foyer. "Now, there's only one entrance to this apartment, and that's this door here leading off the main hall. There aren't any transoms, air shafts, or dumbwaiters in the place, which means that the only way, literally the only way, anyone can get in or out is through this door. Just keep that in mind while you listen to these people's accounts. Now, I'll have the maid brought in." At Oscar's direction, a detective brought in a mulatto woman around 30 years old. She was neatly dressed and exuded an air of competence. When she spoke, her voice was calm and clear, reflecting a level of education that was not commonly found among her peers. Her name was Amy Gibson, and from the preliminary questions posed by Stanford, we gathered the following details. She had arrived at the apartment that morning just after 7, and as was her routine, she let herself in with her own key since her employer typically slept late. A couple of times a week, she came in early to do sewing and mending for Miss Simon before she got out of bed. On this particular morning, she had come to make an alteration to a dress. As soon as she opened the door, she was met with the chaos of the apartment. The Venetian glass doors of the foyer stood wide open, and almost immediately she noticed the body of her mistress on the davenport. She called out to Harley, the night telephone operator on duty, who, after one look at the living room, contacted the police. She then took a seat in the public reception room and waited for the officers to arrive. Her account was straightforward, clear, and articulate. If she was nervous or excited, she managed to keep her emotions well in check. "Now," Stanford said after a brief pause, "let's go back to last night. What time did you leave Miss Simon?" "A few minutes before 7, sir," she replied, her voice steady and monotone, a reflection of her usual manner of speaking. "Is that your regular time for leaving?" "No, I normally leave around 6, but last night Miss Simon wanted my help getting ready for dinner." "Don't you always assist her with dinner preparations?" "No, sir. But last night she was going out to dinner and the theatre with some gentleman, and she wanted to look particularly nice." "Ah," Stanford leaned in. "And who was this gentleman?" "I don't know, sir. Miss Simon didn't mention it." "Can you make any guesses about who it might have been?" "I couldn't say, sir." "And when did Miss Simon inform you that she wanted you to come in early this morning?" "When I was leaving last night." "So it seems she didn't expect any danger or have any concerns about her companion." "It doesn't appear that way." The woman paused, considering. "No, I know she didn't. She was in high spirits." Stanford turned to Oscar. "Do you have any other questions, Sergeant?" Oscar took an unlit cigar from his mouth and leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees. "What jewelry did this Miss Simon have on last night?" he asked gruffly. The maid's demeanor shifted, becoming cool and slightly haughty. "Miss," stressed the miss, to chide him for his lack of respect. "Wore all her rings, 5 or 6 of them, and 3 bracelets, one with square diamonds, one with rubies, and another with diamonds and emeralds. She also had a sunburst of pear-shaped diamonds on a chain around her neck, and she carried a platinum lorgnette set with diamonds and pearls." "Did she have any other jewelry?" "A few small pieces, perhaps, but I'm not entirely sure." "And did she keep them in a steel jewelry box in her bedroom?" "Yes, when she wasn't wearing them." There was a hint of sarcasm in her tone. "Oh, I just thought maybe she locked them up when she wore them." Oscar's irritation grew due to the maid's attitude. He couldn't help but notice that she consistently left out the formal "sir" when responding to him. He stood up, pointing down at the black document box on the rosewood table. "Have you seen this before?" The woman nodded, her expression indifferent. "Many times." "Where was it usually kept?" "In that cabinet." She motioned toward the buhl cabinet with her head. "What was in the box?" "How should I know?" "You don't know," Oscar said, his jaw jutting out. But his aggressive demeanor seemed to have no impact on the unfazed maid. "I have no idea," she replied calmly. "It was always locked, and I never saw Miss Simon open it." The sergeant walked over to the closet door in the living room. "Do you see that key?" he asked, irritation creeping into his voice. The woman nodded again, but this time I noticed a flicker of mild surprise in her eyes. "Was that key always kept on the inside of the door?" "No, it was always on the outside." Oscar shot Quentin a look of intrigue. After a moment of deep thought regarding the knob, he gestured to the detective who had brought the maid in. "Take her back to the reception room, Baron, and get a detailed description of all the Simon jewelry. Keep her there. I'm going to need her again." Once Baron and the maid had left, Quentin leaned back lazily on the davenport where he had been sitting during the interview and sent a spiral of cigarette smoke toward the ceiling. "This is rather enlightening, isn't it?" he remarked. "The young lady has given us quite a bit to think about. Now we know the closet key is on the wrong side of the door, and that our lady friend went to the theatre with one of her favorite suitors, who likely brought her home just before she exited this world." "You think that's helpful?" Oscar retorted, a tone of contempt in his voice. "Just wait until you hear the wild story from the telephone operator." "All right, Sergeant," Stanford interjected impatiently. "Let's move on with this. I suggest we question the janitor first, Mr. Stanford." "I'll show you why," Oscar said, as he walked over to the apartment door and opened it. "Just take a look for a moment, sir." He stepped into the main hall and pointed down a narrow passageway on the left. It was about 10 feet long and ran between the Simon apartment and the bare back wall of the reception room. At the end of the passage was a sturdy oak door that opened into the side courtyard of the building. "That door," Oscar explained, "is the only side or rear entrance to this building. When that door is bolted, no one can get in except through the front. You can't access the building from the other apartments either, because every window on this floor is barred. I made sure to check that right when I arrived." He led us back into the living room. "Now, this morning, after I assessed the situation, I figured our suspect came in through that side door at the end of the passage and slipped into this apartment without being seen by the night operator. So I tried the side door to see if it was open, but it was bolted from the inside, not just locked, but bolted. And it wasn't a flimsy slip bolt that could be pried open from the outside. It was a sturdy, old-fashioned turn bolt made of solid brass. Now I want you to hear what the janitor has to say about it." Stanford nodded in agreement, and Oscar called for one of the officers in the hall. A moment later, a stoic middle-aged German with a sullen expression and pronounced cheekbones stood before us. His jaw was set tightly, and he darted suspicious glances between the two of us. Oscar took on the role of interrogator. "What time do you leave here at night?" he asked, adopting a confrontational tone for some reason. 6 o'clock, sometimes earlier, sometimes later," the man replied in a gruff monotone. He clearly felt frustrated by this unwelcome disruption to his routine. "And what time do you arrive in the morning?" 8 o'clock, as usual." "What time did you leave last night?" "Around 6, maybe a quarter past." Oscar paused to finally light the cigar he had been nibbling on for the past hour. "Now tell me about that side door," he continued, maintaining his aggressive stance. "You said you lock it every night before you leave. Is that correct?" "Yes, that's right," the man replied, nodding vigorously. "But I don't lock it, I bolt it." "Fine, you bolt it then." As Oscar spoke, his cigar bobbed up and down between his lips, smoke and words escaping simultaneously. "And last night you bolted it like always at around 6 o'clock. "Maybe a quarter past," the janitor corrected, with precise German efficiency. "Are you absolutely sure you bolted it last night?" The question was intense. Yes, I'm sure. I do it every night. I never forget." The man's sincerity left no doubt that the door had indeed been bolted from the inside at about 6 o'clock the previous evening. Still, Oscar lingered on the question for several minutes, insisting on reassurance that the door had been secured. At last, he dismissed the janitor. "Honestly, Sergeant," Quentin said with a bemused smile, "that honest Rhinelander really bolted the door." "Of course he did," Oscar replied, exasperated. "And I found it still bolted this morning at 7:45. That's exactly what complicates things so neatly. If that door was bolted from 6 last evening until 8 this morning, I'd love to know who could possibly have arrived in a hearse to explain how the Cardinal's little friend got in here last night." and I'd really like to know how he managed to get out." "Why wouldn't he use the main entrance?" Stanford asked. "It's the only logical route left, based on what you've discovered." "That's what I thought too, sir," Oscar replied. "But just wait until you hear what the phone operator has to say." "And the phone operator's station," Quentin pondered, "is situated in the main hall, halfway between the front door and this apartment. So the man who caused all this commotion last night would have had to walk right past the operator both when he arrived and when he left. Right." "Exactly," Oscar snapped. "And the operator says no one like that came or went." Stanford seemed to pick up some of Oscar's frustration. "Bring him in here. I want to question him," he commanded. Oscar complied with a hint of eager mischief.